It was a chilly autumn morning in downtown Seattle. James Carter, the owner of one of the city's most popular cafe chains, stood outside one of his own locations, but today he looked nothing like the wealthy businessman he was. Dressed in tattered clothes, with unkempt hair and dirt smudged across his face, he blended in with the many homeless individuals who wandered the streets. James had spent years building his business from the ground up, priding himself on creating a welcoming atmosphere for everyone. But lately, he had heard troubling rumors. Stories of employees treating homeless individuals with cruelty, turning them away, and even mocking them. He needed to see the truth for himself. Taking a deep breath, he pulled his ragged coat tighter and shuffled toward the cafe doors. What happened next left him speechless. As James stepped inside, the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. For a moment, he felt a sense of pride. This was his cafe, a place he had built with the vision of bringing comfort to everyone who walked through the doors. But that pride quickly faded when he noticed the disgusted glances from the barista behind the counter. "Sir, you can't be in here," the young employee said sharply, barely concealing his irritation. James hesitated. "I was just hoping to buy a cup of coffee," he said, his voice deliberately shaky, mimicking the weariness of a man who had spent years on the streets. The barista scoffed. "We don't serve people like you. Please leave." James's heart sank. He had expected some coldness, maybe indifference, but outright rejection? Before he could respond, a manager, a woman in her mid-40s with a sharp gaze, stepped in. "What's going on?" she asked. "This guy is loitering," the barista muttered. The manager turned to James with a forced smile, but there was no kindness in her eyes. "Sir, I'm afraid we have a policy. You need to leave now." James searched their faces for any sign of compassion, but all he saw was impatience. He had heard rumors, but experiencing it firsthand was something else. His own employees, the people he trusted to uphold his values, were treating him as if he were invisible or worse, an inconvenience. As he turned to go, a soft voice cut through the tension. "Wait." A young woman, another employee, stepped forward. Her name tag read Emily. She looked uncertain but determined. "Maybe we should let him stay. If he wants to buy a coffee, why can't he?" The manager shot her a warning glance. "Emily, this isn't a charity." "But it's a cafe," Emily countered. "And he's a customer." For a moment, the air was thick with silence. James watched as Emily stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't know who he was. She wasn't defending the owner of the company. She was defending a human being. James felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. Sadness because he saw how easily cruelty had taken root in his own establishment. Hope because there were still people like Emily. He had come looking for the truth. Now he had found it. And he knew exactly what he needed to do next. James hesitated at the door, his fingers tightening around the ragged edges of his coat. He could leave now, walk away, and no one would ever know who he really was. But something about Emily's courage made him stay. He turned back, his gaze settling on her. "I just wanted a coffee," he said quietly. "Nothing more." Emily nodded. "I'll get it for you." Before the manager could protest, Emily stepped behind the counter, grabbed a cup, and filled it with steaming coffee. She placed it on the counter and slid it toward James. That'll be $2.50, she said with a small smile. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of crumpled dollar bills. His hands trembled slightly, not because he was nervous, but because he had seen this scenario play out before in real life with real homeless individuals. And too often it ended with humiliation. The barista rolled his eyes. "You're seriously doing this?" Emily ignored him and took the money. When she handed James his change, their eyes met for a brief second. There was no pity in her expression, only respect. James took a slow sip of the coffee. It was good, rich, and warm, just like he had intended it to be when he first built this cafe. But right now it tasted different, tasted like a test. "Thank you," he murmured. Emily nodded. "Everyone deserves a little kindness." The manager let out a frustrated sigh and crossed her arms. "Fine. You gave him a coffee. Now he needs to leave." James placed the cup down and straightened his posture ever so slightly. He wasn't ready for the big reveal yet, but he wanted to see just how far this situation would go. "Why?" he asked. The manager frowned. "Because we have an image to maintain. If we let one homeless person sit here, more will come. Then paying customers won't feel comfortable." James felt a sharp pang in his chest. So this is what they believe? That people without homes aren't worth a seat at the table? Emily looked at the manager, her brows furrowed. "That's not fair." "It's business," the manager said firmly, "not charity." James exhaled slowly, glancing around the cafe. The customers, business people in suits, students on laptops, couples chatting over pastries, were now watching in awkward silence. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others seemed indifferent. But one man near the window spoke up. "She's right," he said, nodding at Emily. "He paid for his coffee like everyone else. Why shouldn't he stay?" Another woman chimed in. "Yeah, this is a public place, isn't it?" The manager's face hardened, but James saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. She's losing control of the narrative. James took another sip of his coffee, letting the tension settle. Then he placed the cup down carefully, straightened his back, and did something no one expected. He pulled off his tattered beanie, smoothed back his hair, and adjusted his posture. In an instant, the tired, hunched figure of a homeless man disappeared, replaced by the confident presence of a man who had built this business from nothing. Recognition flashed in the manager's eyes first, then the baristas, then slowly the rest of the staff. James Carter was no longer just another face in the crowd. He was their boss. And now they were the ones who looked afraid. A heavy silence fell over the cafe. The manager's face drained of color as she stared at James, her mouth slightly open but no words coming out. The barista took an instinctive step back, as if hoping to disappear behind the espresso machine. James let the silence stretch. He wanted them to feel it, the weight of their actions, the discomfort of realizing who he was. Then, in a calm but firm voice, he spoke. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his gaze fixed on the manager. "A paying customer, who happens to look homeless, isn't welcome here?" The manager swallowed hard. "Mr. Carter, I didn't realize that I was your boss?" he finished for her. He shook his head. "That shouldn't matter." What should matter is how you treat people when you don't know who they are." Emily's face lit up with understanding. The man she had defended wasn't just anyone. He was the owner of the entire cafe chain. She glanced at her co-workers, who now stood frozen, waiting for the fallout. James turned toward the barista. "And you," he said, his voice steady. "You laughed. You mocked someone you thought was struggling. Tell me, is that the kind of person you are? Or is that the kind of person this place has allowed you to become?" The young man's face turned red. He had no answer. James sighed and looked around the cafe. The customers were watching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. Some had likely witnessed similar situations before but had never spoken up. Some had probably ignored them, thinking it wasn't their problem. But today it was a problem, and James was going to fix it. He turned to Emily. "You," he said, his tone softening. "You stood up when no one else did. You treated me like a person, not a problem." He gave her a small nod. "Thank you." Emily looked stunned but grateful. "I just did what felt right," she said. James took a deep breath before facing the manager again. "And you," he said, "I want you to take a good look at this cafe. Do you know why I started this business?" She shook her head weakly. "I built this place to be a community," James said. "Not just for the wealthy, not just for the comfortable, but for everyone. If someone has the money to pay for a coffee, they should be served. If someone needs a place to sit and warm up for a few minutes, we should welcome them, not push them out onto the street." The manager nodded quickly, her hands clasped together. "Of course, sir. I understand now." James studied her for a moment, then made his decision. "No," he said, "I don't think you do." Her eyes widened. "You're fired," he said simply. The cafe went completely silent. The manager's mouth opened in shock. "Wait, Mr. Carter, please." James held up a hand. "If you truly believed in the values of this company, you wouldn't have treated me or anyone else this way. I need people who understand that respect and kindness are not optional in this business." The woman's face crumpled, but she said nothing. Slowly, she stepped aside, her shoulders slumped. James then turned back to Emily. "How long have you worked here?" "6 months," she said hesitantly. He nodded. "How would you feel about a promotion?" Emily's eyes widened. "Me?" "You showed leadership today," James said. "You stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. That's the kind of person I want leading this cafe." Emily blinked, still processing. Then she nodded firmly. "I'd be honored." James smiled slightly. "Good." He took one last look around the cafe. The customers were still watching, whispering among themselves. Some looked impressed. Others looked uncomfortable, maybe because they had ignored what had happened until now. James picked up his coffee cup and took another sip. Still tasted warm and rich, but now it also tasted like change. And he was just getting started. The news of what happened spread quickly. By the next morning, employees at James Carter's cafe chain were buzzing with the story of how their boss had disguised himself as a homeless man and exposed the mistreatment within his own business. Some were shocked. Others were nervous, wondering if their locations had acted the same way. James didn't stop at firing one manager. He knew real change required more than just punishment. Over the next few weeks, he implemented new training for all employees, focusing on empathy, inclusion, and treating every customer with dignity, regardless of their appearance. He partnered with local shelters to provide job opportunities for people experiencing homelessness, offering them a fresh start. And he introduced a pay-it-forward system, allowing customers to buy an extra coffee or meal for those in need. At the cafe where it all happened, things were different now. Emily, now the new manager, made sure of it. Employees were more aware of their actions, treating every customer with kindness. And for the first time in a long time, people without homes felt welcome inside, not just as charity cases, but as valued customers. One afternoon, James returned, this time in his usual sharp attire. He ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching as a man in worn-out clothes hesitated at the door. Emily spotted him immediately and smiled. "Welcome in," she said warmly. "What can I get for you?" The man's shoulders relaxed as he stepped inside. James took a sip of his coffee, a small smile on his lips. This was the kind of cafe he had always envisioned. And now it was finally real.